Hi guys and welcome back to my channel. So today we're continuing our endgame lessons, and as you know we're going over the Rook Endgames with the pawn on the 7th or on the 6th rank. And the thing we absolutely have to talk about is when to push this pawn on the 6th rank to the 7th rank. Now first of all we have to know that if we push our pawn to the 7th rank, and there are no other pawns on the board here except of course a G pawn or an H pawn, which is going to be a draw like we talked about in our previous video. Then if black has his king on these two safe squares and his rook attacking this pawn here, then this is going to be a draw. So you have to be pretty careful about when you push this pawn to the 7th rank, and it's sometimes better to keep it on this 6th rank, because then your king can come here to have shelter from checks. Because when you play a7, then your king has no shelter from the checks when he comes there, and the rook is just going to keep checking the king, and there's going to be no way for white to win this game. But when to push this pawn to this 7th rank? Well, there are basically three plans on when to push it, and today we're going to go over the first plan, and in our next videos we're going to cover the other plans. So today's plan is going to be sacrificing this pawn here in order to get the opponent's rook. And this can happen by the king just leaving these two safe squares. For example, if he goes there, then you can check him and then promote a queen, and then he has to give up his rook, and you just won a pawn for a rook. That's one example. Or he could also go to this f7 square, and then you have this trick when he has to take the pawn, because otherwise you're going to promote, and then you check the king and just grab the rook. That's the other trick. But how do you make your opponent do this? Well, if you have other pawns here on the king side, then this is going to be possible. But of course not the G pawn and not the H pawn, like we talked about, this is going to be a draw. But if you have an F pawn, then you may consider playing A7 at some point. But of course if you're completely sure you're going to get this past F pawn to just kick this king out of his safe squares. Okay, so let's see how white did this in this game. He just played A7 in this position. And the point is that he wants to take this pawn with his king, and black of course cannot protect it because of these checks and promotions. But the question is, how should white get his king to take this f5 pawn? Pause the video and think about it. Okay, so if you thought about going to the king side here, then this is not very good, because I mean, okay, if black plays for example king to h7, the moment you play king to f3, he's going to check you, and you can see that you have to go back, and now there's no way for you to, you know, come here, because this rook is just cutting this rank from you, and you're going to have to come here to the queen side and attack the rook, and then come for this f5 pawn. So it just doesn't make sense to go for the king side. It makes more sense, of course, to go to the queen side, attack the rook, and he has to move. Of course, he has to stay on this file, and then you can go for this f5 pawn. So let's see how white did it. He just played king to d3, going straight to this rook. Black can't do anything, like we said. He can't leave the safe squares, he can't, you know, move the rook anywhere, because then he's just going to promote the queen. So he just played king to g7. We can see king to c3, king to h7, and king to b3. Finally attacking the rook. He has to move, he moved to a1, and now we can see king to b4. Again king to g7, he can't do anything. We can see king to c5, rook to a6, but this really doesn't change anything, because after the move king to e5, black can't do anything. He goes to this a1 square again, and after king to e5, you might say that why can't black just check the white's king and defend this pawn? Now here comes a topic that we've already talked about in one of my previous videos, and this is Zugzwang. That's right, it's Zugzwang. It seems strange, but since we know that this king has only these two squares and this rook has to protect this pawn and also attack this pawn, this is going to be pretty understandable. So now what does white do? He of course plays his king to this e6 square. And now what is black going to do? He can't move anywhere because white is just going to take this pawn, then move the king and just, you know, push this pawn, check the king and then win the game. But let's see how it happened. Black just played king to h7 and we can see king to f6. Absolutely winning. Black of course here can't play something like king to h6. This is even going to be checkmate in one move. So he has to move the rook. And now white gets to, you know, take this pawn here. And this is of course winning. Because like we said, the f pawn wins the game. Because now, let's just say black does nothing. White just goes up the board with his f pawn. And now, at one point, he's going to be really dangerous to promote to a queen here. And black can't do anything. If he tried here to go to this g7 square with his king, it really doesn't change anything because here it comes f6 check. And yeah, I mean, it's just great. If he goes there, you again push the pawn. If he takes the pawn, then of course this is again winning, check, and white promotes to a queen. So white in this game pushed the pawn to this a7 square because he was sure that he can get his king to this f6 square and then just take this pawn off the board, and he knew that this f pawn is just going to win the game. But okay, let's just look at our next example that we have today, and we can see this position here. What do you think about this position? Should white play b7, his pawn from the 6th rank to the 7th rank, or not? Pause the video and let me know. Okay, so in the game, white played b7 and it was incorrect. The simplest win would be something like king to d4, and after rook takes f2, I mean he can move out of this file now because the pawn is not on the 7th rank and white is just not threatening to go there and promote on the next move. So he can take the pawn, but this is just losing because after rook to c8, now he has to go back because otherwise white is going to promote. He goes there to beat this b2 square, and you can see rook to c7 check, white has to move somewhere, and now b7. White is just going to move his king up the board and then promote to a queen. So this would be really bad for black, and I mean white should have played this king to d4 move, but rather he played b7, which was incorrect, and let's see why. White probably had in mind that he's going to create his passed f-pawn and he's going to win the game, but this wasn't possible. Let's see what happened. Black just played king to g7, and now we can see king to d4, rook to b5, not letting white go here and take the pawn. He's still going to, but okay, not on this move. He just played king to c4, attacking the rook. We can see rook to b2, attacking this f2 pawn, but not really, you know, because again he would promote to a queen. So now we can see king to d5, and now black starts checking the white's king from the back, from this d2 square. And what is white going to do? I mean, he can't do anything. I mean, if he goes there, then okay, you go back. What is he going to do? If he goes there, you go there. I mean, he has to do something, right? So after this check, he went to grab this f-pawn and he played king to e5. But now we can see rook to e2 check, and when white takes the black's pawn, then rook takes white's f2 pawn. That's absolutely correct. And now even though white takes the pawn here on g4 and he's 2 pawns up, as you can see, this is going to be a draw. After black's next move, which is rook to b2, of course, going back because there's really a big danger if he does nothing. Like we said, this is really not what black wants. So he plays rook to b2, and this is a complete draw because white doesn't have his passed f pawn, and if he pushes these h and g pawns, he's only going to create a passed, you know, g pawn, which is, like we know, not enough for a win, and it's going to be a draw. So in this game, playing b7 was a mistake by white, but okay, this is really not that easy to see. Maybe if white calculated more deeply, he would see that he really can't win this f-pawn without losing his f-pawn, which is really too bad for him. So okay, let's look at our next example and our last example today. We can see that now white's pawn isn't on the 6th rank, but it's already on the 7th rank. But is this a good thing or a bad thing? In this example here, this is again a bad thing. White, of course, again wants to create his best f-pawn, but how can he do this? White played king to f4, and now tell me guys, can you see the threat that white has? Okay, the threat is just, if black does nothing, to play g4. And the point is, if black takes your pawn, you of course don't take it with the g-pawn, because that's of course a draw. You can see that you're not going to win this because you don't have an f-pawn. But you take it with a king, of course. And on the next move, you're going to play h5 and just exchange these pawns off, and you're going to have passed f-pawn. This is exactly what you want, of course. If you want to win. I mean, if you don't want to win, then okay. But how can black stop this? I mean, I think that it's obvious. His only move to prevent this is rook to a4 check, not giving white time to play g4. He has to move the king, and he moved it to e3. And now the thing that black is going to do in this endgame is just check white's king from the side, which is pretty interesting because in these endgames you don't often see this rook being so annoying with checks, and I mean it's pretty interesting. So what do? You check the white's king, and now of course if white goes back you again check him, but just in case if you don't check him, then your position is losing. You have to check him. If you play something like rook to a1, then again g4. And we saw what happens if he takes your pawn, but what happens if black checks white here again? Then this is again losing for black, because white plays king to g3, and now when you take the pawn, you might think, okay, white cannot take this with his king, he has to take it with his f-pawn, but no, he just plays f4, a stunning move, and you can see what's coming here. h5, and then this passed f-pawn is going to decide the game. So you don't want this, and you just simply check the where are we? Check the white's king, and when he goes to this f2 square, he's really just finding shelter to his king to hide from. These pawns are giving him a nice shelter here, but it's really not that important because what is white going to do here? I mean, black plays rook to a3, and if white defends, of course, again, check, he has to do something, so that's why here he played f4. It looks like white is going to win after rook to a2 with this move. I mean, of course, now if black takes the pawn, this is winning for white. Again, h5, and then this f-pawn is going to be passed here, and it's going to win. But after g4, black doesn't have to take the pawn right away. He can first check the king from the side. You can see that this rook here in this example is so annoying, and white just simply has to move out of this rank. And I mean, what is he going to do? If he plays his king to g2, for example, then you don't immediately take the pawn. I mean, you don't have to. You can just keep checking the white's king. What is he going to do? I mean, you might think that the white's king is going to just get closer to you, and what are you going to do then? I mean, then he's going to take your pawn here and have this f-pawn, right? But it's not that simple, because if white comes too close to this rook, now you can take the pawn, and then you can see that this pawn is going to become pretty dangerous. I hope that I'm not missing anything. Maybe I should play this a move ago here, but I'm not sure. Yeah, probably here. And this pawn gets really dangerous, so white can't just rush to take this rook because black is going to promote this pawn. So it's not easy, and this position is actually here a draw after rook to a3 check. So here again we see the consequences of playing a7 too early and just, not keeping your pawn on this a6 square, just leaving the chance of your king coming there to a7, and then moving the rook, also the king, and then promoting the queen. Because when the pawn is on the 7th rank, this king can no longer hide from the checks on this a7 square, which is of course not good because it's most probably going to be a draw without the pawns on this side of the board. And even though there were pawns on this side of the board, this was still a draw because black's rook was so annoying here, and because white didn't manage to create his best f pawn. This is the most important thing in these endgames when the pawn is on the 7th rank. Okay, so this is the first plan here, winning a pawn for a rook, which happens by white pushing his best f pawn and just getting this black's king out of his safe squares, or if he stays on the safe squares on the h7 square, then this pawn becomes unstoppable. So I hope you guys enjoyed that video. I hope you learned something from it. If you did, please share it. Give me some feedback in the comments. I'll see you in the next video.